to greet you all. Good morning on a beautiful South African morning. And I'd just like to briefly welcome you to the USAf webinar on institutional governance. We all know, all of us who are on this webinar, we know the importance of governance in higher education because good governance leads to progressive and sustainable institutions. And part of good governance includes risk management. Therefore, the theme of the conference today, of the webinar today, is confronting the risks of institutional capture. And this webinar is hosted by USAf, Leadership and Management Strategic Group. And I hope we'll have a good time, share ideas, and learn one or two things that we can take back to our institutions. Without wasting time, let me welcome Prof. Thandi Lewin to welcome you formally and give you the context of the webinar. Thandi Lewin is Deputy Director General at the Department of Higher Education and Training. Thandi? Professor Thandi?
Sorry, I'm just trying to unmute and put my video on. Give me a second.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying to get, I'm not very good with Zoom. Hang on, where is this? There we go. Okay, here I am. Just so you can see that I'm real.
Okay. Thank you, Thandi. You can go ahead.
Okay, cool. I'm going to turn my video off because I'm in the Department of Higher Education and Training and our connectivity is not great. Actually, let's see if it works. Let me just leave it on for now. You'll let me know if it doesn't. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's really exciting to be here with and I want to try and be brief so that we can listen to the really exciting inputs that we're going to have. And what I wanted to do was just to give some context. I was asked also to define something which I'll come to at the end. But I want to say that public universities across the world are under extraordinary pressure. And I'm just trying to paint some of the political and social context within which universities are operating. Universities are expected to deliver excellent teaching that produces adaptable, employable graduates, to produce high quality, socially relevant research, and to remain stable, resilient institutions. And this is all within a context of rapid economic, political, and technological change. And this really is quite a big challenge, especially in such an unequal society as ours is. And at the same time, we're seeing growing public distrust and misunderstanding of universities. Really, this is a big issue, but it's also a global phenomenon, and it's particularly sharp in our context because we have poverty, inequality, and unemployment, which remain entrenched in our society. And university education is seen quite rightly as a pathway out of poverty. Yet we have a situation where our demand far exceeds capacity, and the frustration about this is mounting. And this also affects political trust in universities, and the university's ability to self-regulate is increasingly fragile. But of course, we can understand where the erosion of trust comes from to a certain extent. What we can also see is that across the world, political interference in universities is growing. South Africa is not immune from this. However, we do have relatively high levels of academic freedom and institutional autonomy compared to many other parts of the world where we are seeing this erode rapidly. Although these are under pressure, and of course, there are calls for greater accountability. So some of these demands are legitimate. Public institutions do need to account for public resources, but we also need to be honest that much of what passes for accountability in a kind of audit culture environment, in a rankings environment, is quite performative, and it's performative rather than meaningful in some contexts. So there's a widening gap, I think, between real accountability and compliance-driven oversight. And at the same time, universities have become incredibly complex organizations. So governors of institutions are running essentially large enterprises which have major infrastructure footprints, sophisticated IT and huge cyber risk profiles, incredibly fastly growing enrollments, although not as fast as we need, and significant financial responsibilities. So governing these institutions requires deep expertise and very careful balance and very firm oversight. So it makes universities very vulnerable to external influence, particularly where large budgets are involved. The other thing that I think is a big issue in our context is that we have a system formally built on cooperative governance, and this is embedded in our policy and legislative frameworks. But this principle is frequently misunderstood or selectively applied. So universities operate under a state supervisory model that assumes relative autonomy, balanced by public accountability. In essence, it's a negotiated form of self-regulation. But over time, layers of reporting, audits, and oversight mechanisms have accumulated, which are reinforced by a global audit culture that can obscure rather than strengthen institutional purpose. But there's also the history that we have. And Professor Buhlungu has reminded us how profoundly academic freedom and institutional autonomy were eroded under apartheid in telling the story of the University of Fort Hare, how universities were reduced to instruments of the state, isolated, fragmented, and intellectually frozen. And some of the vulnerabilities we face today echo aspects of that past, particularly in other parts of the world, which are rapidly changing under political pressure. Jonathan is here, so Prof. Jansen is going to talk to how institutions can be exposed to financial corruption and the huge risk of capture. We have pressure from Parliament, it becoming a big debate in many areas at the moment, but a real sense of questioning of the self-regulation of universities, along with a frustration about whether universities have met the transformation goals of society. And these are legitimate questions, however they may appear or be responded to. And then, of course, Amit Bauer argued that we needed a social compact between universities and society. And this was post Fees Must Fall, given that universities are still seen as elite and removed from society, even though this may not be the reality. So I just want to, I think I need to wrap up because I haven't been speaking for 10 minutes, but it's going to come very quickly to an end. These are some of the contextual issues that I think we need to pay attention to, that universities can't ignore their context. We do have to account for the work of universities. We need to defend it, and we need to demonstrate quite convincingly and clearly how it serves the public good. But doing so does require autonomy. And there's no genuine academic freedom or no meaningful teaching and research without institutional independence. But equally, we can't defeat into defensiveness or silence. So if universities do not speak for themselves on behalf of society and future generations, then others will do so for us. And that is increasingly easy to do in a world that is so where communication is ubiquitous all the time across multiple platforms, and anyone can speak on any issue, whether it is true or not. So we need a collaborative voice, and we need to share principled engagement across the sector. I was actually asked to define the term institutional capture, and I'm fairly sure that the speakers will do so very well by the end of the day. But just to say that it is a growing risk and it takes multiple forms. And I think partly it's about they're sort of three different issues. One is about misunderstandings about what universities are and what universities actually do, which comes from instrumentalism, and it comes from many different places, some of which I've talked about. There's also the issue of unresolved social justice and unmet expectations of university, which I think also causes people to want to take control of universities. And then there's outright criminality, which we see, of course, also in our society in many public institutions. And in each case, the result is the erosion of universities as public institutions serving the public good. So I think that's something that we need to focus on. And I think this webinar is a great opportunity for us to reflect honestly on these pressures, to ask difficult questions about autonomy, accountability, and public trust, and to begin shaping more coherent and collective responses from the university sector and from those of us that believe universities are important. So thanks a lot. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Thandi, for setting the stage for us. It's going to be quite an interesting discussion. and considering how wide the topic is, we'll try and direct the discussions and make sure that at the end of the day, we come out with some good takeaway messages that we can take back to our institutions. There are 119 stakeholders on this webinar. These include members of university councils, academics, management, and some academics. So I think it's going to be interesting, and we look forward to all of you participating in this webinar. Can I just move on then to, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Letitia Moja, but I think the slideshow has already shown who I am. At the moment, I'm visible on the video in there. Can I then move on to ask Professor Jonathan Johnson? Professor Jonathan Johnson is a seasoned academic leader, has led a few universities in this country and also some under administration, and is going to share with us his views. Professor Johnson?
Thank you very much, Professor Morja, Letitia, and thank you all for inviting me to speak. So I would like to speak to you about institutional capture and what that means for the South African University. Next slide, please. I'm going to just build on Tandi's initial inputs and perhaps just remind you that when we speak about institutional capture of universities, more familiar to many of us is, of course, what the media in South Africa called state capture, particularly under the presidency of Jacob Zuma. So what does institutional capture mean for me? And for those of you who know, I've written a book more or less on the subject called Corruption with Wits University Press, and it's an attempt to fill out the meaning in the practices of several South African universities. Next slide, please. So let me read this to you because I think it is important to capture every word here because of how easily one could miss the essence of what is said here. So it is systematic, it is deliberate, and it is intentional, a process of undermining governance and management. So it's both the council and the executive to undermine their processes in order to trigger institutional stability and in the process shift authority to other powers in the university. This has been happening at several of our universities, more dramatically perhaps in recent times, and again this week, as you will see, at the University of Fort Hare. Next slide. Let's agree that not every instance of dysfunction in a university is institutional capture. There are many degrees of capture depending on which university one is speaking about and which units within a university are in question. So you could have HR and finance, for example, effectively captured while the rest of the institution still has graduation ceremonies and classes that are taught and so on and so forth. So by institutional capture, I mean when the entire core of the university's operations are undermined in order to enable the looting of an institution for whatever purposes. Next slide. I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are very visible forms of institutional capture, such as we've seen at some of our universities, the buying and selling of degrees. Those are sort of very open, very public, appears in the media and so on. So it's very easy to recognize. But there are also less visible forms of capture, such as when the entire research admin process behind academic publication has been compromised. Now, this is not something you see very often unless you're a researcher or you're sitting in the DHET or the CHE and you see corruption of the kinds that I'm going to just point out now. For example, when one individual submits more than 60 publications in order to optimize the income from state subsidy, you know, and I know as academics, that's impossible. Even in disciplines or fields where there might be large numbers of people working in an engineering or science laboratory, nobody is able to do this without really being corrupt. Okay. And what has always surprised me is that the institutions that benefit from individual corruption don't call it out. They sit quiet and so on. Now, this is not visible to the public eye in the same way that selling degrees is, but it is a klug. It is something that corrupts research admin. Secondly, academics who publish with students out of their theses and dissertations that they were paid to supervise. Okay, I've got about 24 master's doctoral students, apart from postdocs at the moment. I make a very clear ruling with them. This is your work. On the inside of your dissertation cover, there's a page that says, I swear that this is my work. I get paid by Stellenbosch University to supervise you, to mentor you, and so on. I cannot double dip. I cannot both get paid for supervising you, and then once you've produced your own research, I then publish with you out of that research. The student gets nothing, but I get an added slice of revenue. This is corruption. And when I mentioned this at a USAf, was it the USAf function, or I forget which function it was, at this Eternal Hotel where everybody has their conferences in Johannesburg, Birchwood. I mean, to my surprise, a lot of the academics, senior academics, they said, but what's wrong with this? This is what happens when you no longer have moral clarity about what is right and what is wrong. This is clearly wrong, and it's a form of corruption. And but you don't see it as easily. And then, of course, the academics who knowingly publish in predatory journals where there is little to no peer review at a very low bar for academic publication. And guess what? You show up with those journals and you get promoted. You know in your field which journals are predatory. And it's really not a very productive discussion to say, oh, yes, but how will we know? And, you know, and sometimes it's on the DHET list and so on. That's a sideshow. That's a distraction from the issue, that you know what a quality journal is in your field unless you're asleep at the wheel. And I know what the quality journal is in my field. But when you go after these, I suppose corrupt people will call it low-hanging fruits, then you have a form of corruption less visible to the public. Next slide, please. What is different today about institutional capture compared to, say, 10 years ago is, and I deliberately underline this for emphasis, is the routinization of violence against those that stand in the way of corruption. I remind you that there are people, staff members, who died at the University of Fort Hare in the past few years for standing up to corruption. You know, sometimes an innocent, like the driver of the Vice Chancellor, sometimes the head of the fleet, etc. But just warned ahead of time, we will take you out unless you bend to our aspirations as corrupt people. People have died. I've interviewed widows of some of these people. It is absolutely heart-wrenching. And to think that this can happen within a place of higher learning is, to my perhaps idealized view of a university, quite shocking, etc. But this is not just Fort Hare, this is also other universities, but I'm not going to mention the names here for fear of distraction. Next slide. We have to understand institutional capture as a relational problem. That is, if you look at it simply as something that happens within a university, you don't understand how that corruption within a university is supported by, encouraged, connected to corruption on outside the university. And not referring to any university in particular, you know who they are. When the municipal taps run dry, especially in the rural universities, you have an elite institution sitting on a hill, and people on the outside, whether it's taxi drivers or people in the community, sort of say, wait a minute, there is another state-funded entity to be captured, and so on. So you have to understand how people sometimes who are members of council are also people on the outside of university, and they work hand in hand to enable and sustain capture of the kind we are talking about. We sometimes make a mistake. I make a mistake to think that universities as institutions are exceptional. That is, they're not like state departments, they're not like municipal offices. But I've had to change my thinking about that as I've seen universities get dragged down to become simply another office of state to be vandalized. Next slide. So how does institutional capture happen? There are many examples, but I just want to give you 3 that in my experience, especially as an administrator, became so clear to me. When people don't stay in their lanes as spelled out in the Higher Education Act, then you are asking for trouble. So, for example, this is probably the most common reason for institutional collapse. When a vice-chancellor wants to make governance decisions, or when a council chairperson or deputy wants to make management decisions. I used to have regular meetings, sometimes once a week, when I was in Bloemfontein, with my chair of council, Judge Ian van der Merwe, and then occasionally with my deputy chair, Edward Kieswetter, now at SAST. And the entire discussion went on one thing. I govern the place, said the judge, you manage the place. And I would remind him, I manage the place under the instructions of council, and you govern the place. When those train lines cross each other, it's a matter of time before there's an administrator. This is crucially important. And I've seen things that made my little hairs stand on end, like a vice chancellor deciding on their own salary. Never imagined something like that. And so there's an example. When students sit on tender committees, I guarantee you, they will be connected to outside interests who pay them to corrupt that tender process. Any university that still has, and I hope it's not the case anymore, students on tender committees, you are playing with fire, because it's a state capture initiative. And thirdly, when the institutional forum, which is it's got fairly limited powers, to be honest. And the only place where I saw the institutional forum have a powerful role, despite its limited statutory function, was at DOT. They had a fantastic institutional forum that would advise council, but not want to be council, And this is yet another way in which people don't stay in their lanes and cause havoc. Number 8. Ultimately, and we have to face this as South Africans, ultimately institutional capture happens when the quality and the integrity of council membership is compromised. It's as simple as that. And I have seen people's lives ruined, chairpersons and deputy chairs ruined, their reputation smudged because of council members who are there for no other purpose than to loot the place. And a question that every council member must ask itself all the time is a very simple question, a very powerful question, the only question that matters in managing a university, and that is, what is in the best interest of the university? Not in my best interest. What is for my political party's best interest? What is in the best interest of the university? That is the only question. And if you're guided by that lodestar, everything else falls into place. Number 9, almost done. I have to say this, though. Management sometimes creates the conditions that enable disruptive politics to enter the university council and management. And so if management makes poor financial decisions, if management stays on long after their contract expires, if management appoints people who are connected to them, family members, political party affiliates, then you are part of the problem. And it opens the door for that kind of disruptive politics. And finally, what can we do about this? So I want to suggest a few things for you to consider. Number one, we should, 30 years into our democracy, drastically reduce the number of council members. 7 should be sufficient. Harvard senior governance structure is called the corporation. It's only got 12 members plus the president. It has an operating revenue base of $6.7 billion. Okay, that is more than all of our universities combined, obviously. But it's only 7 people. And so this representational politics of the 1980s and 90s, where every body must be represented, in a university, it is asking for trouble, okay? Because the more people you have, the more you have political interests from the outside, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, as a first-year student, one still please say, no, but Prof, everything is political. I agree with that, of course. There's no question about that. I'm talking about the particular kind of corrupted politics where you're not there for the best interests of the university. You are there for other ends. So reduce that number. There is no magic attached to 30 plus members. Number 2, bullet 2, do not pay council members any fees. In fact, make it an effort to appoint members who are financially self-sufficient. When people come to a council member, or for that matter, to any board meeting, simply to make money, they already compromised. They will find it very difficult not to be drawn into corrupt activities to boost their financial status. I know of one university that years ago, I don't think it does it anymore, would even require council members to pay their own travel and accommodation if they were coming from outside. Obviously, that was a different era when council members were actually quite well off. They were jurists, they were, captains of industry and so on. That's not the case now. So, but
No, I got
certainly,
confused. I don't know why bengihamba ngale and inama-hams amambi. You're the first one. Was too
that's
high.
that's certainly. Could
Okay,
somebody put off that mic?
Can we mute? Teboho, can we mute? Teboho? Rassi, can we mute the other person?
Muted already?
Thank you.
So don't pay council members. Next slide. Remove the influence of the minister, whom, I don't know if this is still the case, the minister used to appoint 3 to 5 members of the governing body. I worked very hard with my chair of council to say, don't allow the minister to have more than 3 members. Sometimes that works. Sometimes, and I won't mention names, I've seen ministers who appoint people who are consummate professionals, utterly concerned only with, they don't come with their union or their political party, or they come to serve with their skill set a particular set of interests that boosts the university. But I've also seen when it doesn't work, when the minister sends political operatives, it's the end of the university. I don't think this is necessary at all, okay, for ministers to still appoint members to the governing body, to council. Next slide, almost done. Appoint council chairs and deputy chairs of the highest integrity, men and women of wisdom, people who are fiercely independent, people who can't be swayed by the political forces on the outside. There are universities that have such people. I think Walter Sisulu University probably has one of the best council chairs of the 26 publics. When Kisbeto was my deputy chair, I can assure you he would often challenge me, but he had this singular question that drove him, which was the best interests of the university. A vice-chancellor loves to have people like that who are critical and supportive at the same time. I'm sure there are other persons like that in some of our universities around the country, but I've also seen the worst of them, where people come there, they have very light qualifications. They don't understand what a university is about in the first place, and they're there to make money. And next slide, if there is a next one. You dare not appoint to your council people who are heads of municipalities that are corrupt and dysfunctional. You're asking for trouble. And there has to be a vetting process. So next slide. Okay, seems as if I'm done. Thank you very much, Chairperson. I don't know if there's a Q&A somewhere in the day, but thank you. And this presentation, I'm sure, will be made available on request from USAf. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jansen. Thank you for actually highlighting some of the enablers of institutional capture. But I think some of the key things that you raised is the issue of drawing a line between governance and management, and also just focusing on serving the best interest of the university. And I think if all of us on this webinar can follow that, we'll have much better and much more sustainable institutions. Thank you very much. We're going to move to the next keynote speaker, Professor Thandwa Mthembu. Professor Mthembu.
Yes, Prof. Muja, Letitia, thank you very much. Can I get on with the job?
Yes,
hello?
Carry on, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me call everybody colleagues. Good morning. And I must thank Prof. Mbati, Dr. Matutu, and every member of USAf, especially the HELM program, who must have thought hard about how to organize this webinar to start with, and who should participate in it. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Reflecting on a matter that goes to the very heart of how universities stop being universities, as Professor Jansen has illustrated through his talk. It's always good to know what something is, but even better knowing what it is not. What the university is not will be the focus of my talk. We meet at a time when the university is existentially in a triple crisis of hegemony, legitimacy, and its hitherto institutional and a unique institutional systemic being. In fact, Prof. Thandi Lewin referred to this crisis, which I call a triple crisis. The crisis of institutional systemic being includes issues of our freedoms as universities that allow universities to exercise their purpose unfettered. And again, Prof. Jansen referred to the challenges around cooperative governance and so many other things that seek to limit the freedoms that allow universities to do what their purpose is. In South Africa, particularly, attempts at institutional capture, whatever the definition is, are just adding a fourth crisis, in my view, forcing the existential position of the university into a quadruple crisis. So it's no longer just hegemony, legitimacy, and the institutional, but it's also this added operational element of institutional capture, making it a quadruple crisis. So while this multi-pronged crisis may rear its ugly head anywhere in the world, as Professor Lewin actually pointed to that quite a lot in her opening remarks. In our local content of blatant and state-sponsored corruption, as the Zondo and Madlanga commissions have proved, the stakes are much higher and the quadruple crisis is more acute. By the way, not being a social scientist, I'm not certain what really defines institutional capture. I hadn't looked at your definition, Professor Jansen, of institutional capture. I guess after this, I will look deeper into that. Neither have I seen anything that really defines what state capture is, like a social scientist would define it, not what politicians may define it to be. Some of you may know that mathematicians need precise definitions, axioms, theorems to make sense of things. We don't quite have these clear, or at least when I prepared this, it wasn't very clear to me. So allow me to just flounder like this country is doing anyway. Everybody is floundering in this country. So rather than focus on definitions, allow me to focus on what the university is not, as I said earlier. When the university is no longer what it is, or when the environment in which it operates forces it to be what it is not, it would have been hollowed out of its essence and it would have been captured. Its purpose would remain bastardized. Its very existence, as we know it, would cease. Granted, given our society's history, socio-economic advancement, nation building are part of the societal outcomes and impacts expected of universities. But behind these expected outcomes and impacts are deep, complex, and interrelated philosophical connotations. I'm using the word connotation as opposed to denotations, but connotations of democracy and transformation that debilitate and bastardize the university, making it what it is not. There are many other philosophical connotations that do this. I'll just focus on these two for now. The fitness for purpose of these, that is, connotations of democracy and transformation to a university's institutional systemic being. These must be well understood if we are not to make the university what it is not. Societal expectations are both a boon and a curse in a variety of dimensions. Knowing that people are the source of everything, there is no doubt that when people are involved, we will see progress, but we'll also see retrogression. In short, sometimes we'll see a boon, sometimes it will be a curse that we experience. A boon occurs when our engagement in these two concepts within the university, namely democracy and transformation, it occurs and can be seen as a boon when we see it rekindling our hegemony, legitimacy, and our institutional systemic being within our society. A curse occurs when the university's misengagement or misapplication of these concepts chips away at our unique institutional systemic being and thereby begins to impugn our hegemony and legitimacy. In the 20 minutes I have, during which I must share, well, it's less than 20 minutes now, I should share 20 years of experience as a vice chancellor and principal. I must rather focus on the curses which make the university what it is not. Essentially, to stick to the 20 minutes provided for the address, I must effectively spend 0.66666, about half of a second per year of my management experience sharing those experiences. It's a daunting task. I won't be able to do that. So, as I said earlier, I will just address the pitfalls or curses in the practice of ill-fitting connotations of democracy and transformation in higher education, given how fundamental these concepts are in our polity and in our system, the higher education system, and in our country. Democracy and transformation, get me well, are noble notions. I'm not talking about their connotations. They are noble notions. There's no doubt about that. But I argue rather that their practice in university environments borrowed purely from the political arena is a curse in so many ways. if the university should not become what it is not, universities must start to practice these notions of democracy and transformation differently. So that's the first thing I will deal with in this talk. The second thing I will deal with, I will survey various university stakeholders, internal and external, and how they become a curse and work towards making the university what it is not. Interlarded with all of this, I will provide examples of my own self-agency and self-bureaucracy over the 20 years or so I've been a vice chancellor and principal. Well, actually, it's a total of 30 years as a university senior stroke executive manager. In this period, I've been called an anarchist, like in the book titled UNIN to UFS, 25 years, published by the University of Free State. If you read that book, you'll find reference to two anarchists. One of those is reference to me. I've been called an executive who doesn't know whether he is hunting with the hounds or running with the hares by an English professor vice chancellor when I chaired a broad transformation forum in the mid-90s. I've been called a hooligan during the 2012 attempted capture of CUT. I've been called a heavy-handed autocrat at DUT, where I currently work. So there is a lot that I could share, but as I said earlier, I have only 0.666666 of a second per year to share. And obviously, it's a daunting task, as I said. So let me deal with the connotations of democracy and transformation. Student organizations and unions in particular, steeped in political rhetoric, often insist on politically inclined democratic practice. They think, erroneously in my view, that this type of democratic practice is the only one that exists and must be applied in all facets of life, including in a university environment. Because the university is about the pursuit of truth using the scientific method, it does not practice the politically inclined aggregative form of democratic practice that stakeholders always wish for. Rather, it is the deliberative form of democratic practice, which is more suited to the university. Actually, universities are not the only ones who use this type of democratic practice. The judiciary uses it to some limited extent, though. When a university no longer practices the deliberative form of democracy, it becomes what it is not. I would thus argue that such a university would have been hollowed out of its essence and captured intellectually. The tenets of deliberative democracy are dispassion, reason and debate, analysis and rationality, facts and evidence, triangulation and replication, quality and excellence. In academia, the best idea, even from one person, must win the day for the entire university, no matter what the majority wishes could prevail. When this deliberative connotation of democratic practice no longer pertains at the university, whatever the prevailing democratic practice would be a curse. The university would have become what it is not. Its essence would have been hollowed out. It would have been captured intellectually. In my regular interactions with the SRC every year, when I exercise some agency in student leadership, I always give a crash course on, amongst others, Jürgen Habermas's theory of communicative action and rationality, as opposed to what Habermas calls strategic and self-interested action. In my view, it's this strategic and self-interested action that spoils a lot of things in our university environments. Social-political ideals that student leaders are more interested in tend to be more about self-interested action. We thus have a duty as university leaders. We must proselytize intellectually and academically and not politically. If we were to apply the concept of aggregative democratic practice at a university, students, who are always in the majority in a university, would decide many things in self-interested ways. In fact, what Professor Jansen talked to earlier about publishing with students, about selling degrees and so on, are all things that academics got drawn in through self-interest by those that they collude with. So there's a lot that students would decide. They would probably decide when the academic year must start, and I don't know whether they are not already doing that in our universities. When lectures must start, who deserves to pass, who must join a protest. There's a lot of that in our universities where those who claim not to want to be part of a protest get forced to be part of a protest. Under these circumstances, the university is no longer what it is. Under these circumstances, its essence has been hollowed out. It has been captured internally. When students are the ones who decide when to go to lectures, when they will not go to lectures. Let me leave democracy a little bit, or its connotation and application, and go to transformation. Transformation is about how we address inequities, broaden access, and build institutions that serve society. But we must be honest, at times, the very same noble concept could be a curse in practice and make the university what it is not. Let's just take the example of a recent report to the effect that 7.7% or 12%, it depends which document you read, of academics at our universities are foreign nationals. In the good name of transformation, there is this hullabaloo about this. But numbers don't lie. In South Africa, with lots of foreigners who consider this country a haven for criminality, it's intriguing, at least to me, that the fact that we have 7.7% of our academics as foreign nationals, mostly from our dear continent, that this becomes the focus of the nation's attention. Meanwhile, universities in the UK have about 33% of their academics as foreign nationals. In the USA has about 23% of pre-tenure foreign academics, which suggests a much higher figure when tenured academics are included. And in the US, this figure has been increasing at about 13% a year over the last few years. So there is much more than the 23% of pre-tenure foreign academics. I do know South Africans have this jaundiced view of being exceptional in this continent. Could our universities be considered exceptional and compete with universities in other jurisdictions who have no qualms about a small percentage of academics being foreign nationals? So unless we really wish to be exceptionally dismal, then we'll have a problem with the 7.7% or 12% or whatever. It's nothing close to the 33% in the UK or the more than 23% in the USA. I raise this now controversial matter because I thought even though South African universities constitute a small subsystem in the world, our subsystem punches above its weight, and our subsystem prides itself for leading in our continent. I thought we would like it to continue to lead and exploit whatever available skills there are in our continent and the world over. This is when the practice of transformation becomes a curse and making the university what it is not. This is when the essence of a university is hollowed out. And this is when the university gets captured by socio-political agendas. There are many other examples I could give, and as you know, there's just not enough time. But let me quickly, and Chair, please stop me if I'm really going over time. I prepared only about 5 pages, and I thought I was going to be able to read, just for the sake of discipline, within 3 minutes a page, but I'm not sure whether I'm doing that very well right now. So let me now make some fleeting comments on how other stakeholders become a curse and make the university what it is not. I'll share a few examples that show such despicable behavior at convocation, council, ministerial levels. Given the time constraints, again, one cannot be exhaustive. Let me not talk much about the Quad Helix partnerships, because that's something I thought about in order to frame the types of stakeholders that we need to look into as we think about the issue of institutional capture. But let me also not, in the interest of time, let me not say much about Professor Janssen's recent book, Corrupted, but only to take something small within it, where he asserts that university begins to lose its essence, in short, becomes what it is not, when it is no longer defined by the academic project, but by its status as a concentrated and exploitable resource. A concentrated and exploitable resource by both internal and external stakeholders alike. Of course, this phrase is unsettling, but it captures precisely the malaise of loss of hegemony, legitimacy, and our institutional systemic being, and thus only become a gorging trough. Universities face real pressures from organized networks, both internal and external, that seek to hold sway in decision-making and to exploit institutional resources. I'm not going to say much about my alma mater, the University of Fort Hare. Let me just go straight to my experiences at DUT and perhaps at CUT. The first 10 years of my vice chancellorship at CUT, between 2007 and 2016, I had no bodyguards. But when, in fact, just to demonstrate how safe the environment was, in 2009, at CUT, we fired a security director who was feared and rumored to have been part of the apartheid police establishment. I was told, beware, you are going to die if you fire this gentleman. But without bodyguards, and by the grace of God, I should say, I used to drive by his house every morning between 4:45 and 5 o'clock on my way to Virgin Active without any incident after he had been fired, 2009. But in 2018, in KZN, of course, KZN is well known for murders, after a cardboard coffin with my name on it was carried around on campus at DUT, I was put on close protection. When real guns blazed from business forums, I had to be put on close protection. When we cracked a network of iniquity and corruption, which led to 4 to 5 high-profile suspensions, including that of the then CFO and the procurement manager, I had to be put on close protection. When in 2017, we suspended a director of student housing whose son had been playing the role of middleman with landlords, between landlords and DUT. I was advised, beware, you could disappear without trace if you mess up with that gentleman. When the said director was asked how his son could possibly be involved in DUT's business, he said, oh, I declared this. It's well known around DUT that this is the case. And I seem to be the person who had been making a molehill out of an anthill. But forget suspensions and dismissals of 2018. That's ancient history, relatively speaking. Since about June 2025, we've either dismissed or suspended close to 5 executive senior management officers after serious allegations of irregular and even corrupt practices. In March 2025, just last year, when our budget for our security guarding services suddenly increased by 32% after bids had been submitted, and I smelt a rat, I got a call from a former director of security that I understand has been employed by another university, who had just resigned a month before after probably thinking he had successfully thrown a javelin, as we could call it, requesting that I meet with the company the BEC in which he had participated had evaluated to be the preferred bidder. Deep elements of corruption could not be missed in this when I'm asked for a meeting by the person who had been considered the preferred bidder. Right in academia, as Professor Janssen was mentioning, that deep within academia, when we had about 33 or so people calling themselves academics, but who had no master's degrees, there are people, the ones who are turning DUT and other institutions to what they are not, who defended this broad daylight betrayal of our academic project, Turning a blind eye to realities like these hollows out the university's essence and make the university what it is not. I keep asking myself, rather rhetorically, how did we get here? Well, the answer is easy. And in fact, Professor Jansen has said a few things that suggest why we are where we are. The culture of corruption is deeply embedded in South Africa. If the political leaders of this country, if the police are all mired in corruption, many South Africans begin to think they can earn something without exerting themselves. Why then would corruption not permeate every part of our society, the university included? It should really not be found in the universities. Corruption should not be found in universities simply because the university is that conscientious microcosm of society that must call out its wrongs and help to shape a new progressive culture. This is as much as what a friend of mine, Eunice Ballum, that I served at Wits with, has said many times. How about our September 2024 legal battle between management and council at DUT? We went to the Durban Labour Court, to the Durban High Court. A group of external members of council, driven largely by members of convocation, beware of members of convocation, sought to remove first the chair of council and then, in his absence, me and some of my executive colleagues. Some of those members and their networks had once held a meeting with me in about 2018, telling me they had supported my appointment, but I had been failing them. Actually, I didn't even know them when I applied. I had not held any meeting with them before I applied, but somehow I had failed to deliver. Of course, during that meeting, I pretended I never understood what they had been getting at. When they eventually got the courage to say plainly that I have not delivered because I have not given them any tender, I immediately ended the meeting and told them I'll never meet them again. Behind the September 2024 legal battles were these direct historical solicitations I had rebuffed then, because some of those people had been brought into council through convocation as representatives of convocation. So, colleagues, as I close, you should all know that institutional capture occurs when external and internal actors, or both, are in collusion, and they gain inappropriate influence over university priorities, whether academic, financial, or administrative. It is not only corruption in the narrow financial sense. It may also be about mission drift, with universities becoming what they are not. It is about decisions gradually shifting away from academic integrity, public value, excellence, and scholarly independence towards political loyalty, commercial pressures, and internal factional interests. When institutional energy shifts towards internal battles and external pressures, the academic project becomes only secondary. And when that happens, the university loses its center of gravity and becomes what it is not. It remains cursed, it remains bastardized. In short, just do 4 things at the minimum if you find yourself in situations like this. Firstly, know the Higher Education Act, the statute, the university policies, standard operating procedures, front to back, back to front. Read and read and read everything before you. Secondly, establish a good, incorrupt working relationship among the Vice-Chancellor, the Registrar. The Registrar must be knowledgeable, must be authoritative, must be firm. And the Chair of Council, who must be in command and must understand this connotation of deliberative democracy very well, and must be fully engaged in his or her own work and not idle. Idle chairs are very dangerous. Thirdly, do the right thing all the time and with utmost integrity. Fourthly, keep prodigious records of your actions and decisions, facts and evidence, not only with yourself, but with others. I mean, you could share with your PA for purposes of having corroborating evidence in case your records may get destroyed. Fifthly, have the courage of your conviction in assisting the registrar in applying relevant legislation and policies, even against counsel when it might be straying. As I said, people are a source of progress and sometimes retrogression, and that may exist even within council itself. Some members of council do not understand, let alone appreciate, the collegial nature in the practice of deliberative democracy in the university. And the registrar must help them to understand all of that. So let me close with a simple reflection. Universities do not collapse overnight. They weaken gradually. As noted earlier, they weaken gradually through small compromises, blurred boundaries, silent acceptance of deviations. But the opposite is also true. Universities could strengthen gradually through consistent ethical leadership, through professional management and governance, through protecting the academic project in every decision. If we return collectively to that center, institutional capture loses its power and the university will remain what it is. Because when the academic project remains strong, institutional capture finds no space to grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Thando. You went 10 minutes over your time, but it was quite an interesting. Why can I stop you when we are all learning from each other? Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
For your listening. Thank you. I had thought your calculation would be much more accurate than all of us who are not mathematicians.
Mathematicians are not good in arithmetic. That's a problem.
Thank you very much, and I think we've got a few things to take home from your presentation, and about the nobility of the concepts of democracy and transformation, but needing to guard against their misapplication, and because their misapplications will hollow the university assets. I think these are some of the things that will keep us thinking if we want to take higher education institution to the next level. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Let's move on. Let's move on with our program. We are now going to get into a panel discussion. I'm going to get, there are 4 contributors in this discussion, in this panel. I'm going to ask each one to try and stick to their 10 minutes. I'm going to start off with Dr. Witty-Green, CEO of Council for Higher Education. Dr. Witty-Green.
Thank you very much.
Before he comes on, I'm just going to ask all the participants to prepare their questions so that when we get to engagement time, we can quickly go through that. Thank you, Prof. Witty-Green. Dr. Witty-Green.
Thank you very much, Prof. Moja, and good morning, colleagues. Really great to be here. I'm going to use a few slides just to frame my input as a way of organizing my own thoughts. And hopefully I'm going to be shorter than the 10 minutes. So I came at this from the angle of what are the range of governance, leadership, and management challenges, weaknesses that are evident in the system. In essence, the early warning signs that potentially could be contributing to creating an environment in which governance failure starts to happen and in which institutional capture could set in. And I drew from the audits. So the CHE has recently completed institutional audits for all 26 universities. And the audits have their strengths and have their weaknesses. There are critiques of them, but they also do provide quite a lot of information at a particular point in time for us to engage with. The audits looked at a range of focus areas. And one of the focus areas was on governance, strategic planning, management, and leadership, and how these support the core of academic functions. So I drew on these, undertook a thematic analysis, a bit quick and dirty, using ChatGPT, but also using a human-in-the-loop approach, engaging with the large language model in a way that interrogated the data and looked for consistency through the outcomes. And I then present what came through from that. So particular themes came through quite strongly around strategy, execution and misalignment, governance structures and role clarity, leadership capacity, policy implementation, accountability systems, institutional culture, risk management, stakeholder participation, and council effectiveness. I'm going to just briefly talk to each one of them. So the issue of strategy is that it's often symbolic that all our institutions put strategy in place. We have these ambitious plans, strategy 2030 and so on. But what the audits tended to show was a poor translation of strategy into operations, and particularly weak alignments with budgets and quality systems. So even though the North Star is there, the ambition, the actual execution becomes problematic. In terms of governance structure and role clarity, we've already seen this coming through in the inputs of our keynotes. Blurred roles, council, management, senate, and the institutional forum, a slippage between those, overreach of different structures into the mandates and operations and functions and responsibilities of the other structures. A particular concern is how senates have become weaker and weaker in executing their responsibility of oversight and ownership of the academic project. We have weak delegation frameworks and misalignment with statutes. Leadership capacity presented as quite a key issue in terms of this area. Vacancies in key roles, acting appointments, weak succession planning, and limited leadership training. In terms of policy implementation, and Prof just reinforces now the essentialness of knowing policies and actually working with them and implementing them effectively. Across the system, what was observed was outdated policies that are not reviewed and kept up to date, weak enforcement, poor knowledge of policies, compliance gaps, and no policy tracking systems, which then creates the space for things that are outside of policy to actually become operational. Accountability systems, also weak performance management, a poor KPI alignment, a limited consequence management. So even where transgressions are observed, the ability or the choice that institutions make around follow-up may be lacking, and maybe not follow-up, rather cover-up seems to be the order of the day, and weak monitoring systems. Institutional culture, weak communication, limited stakeholder buy-in, a culture of fear in some cases across institutions, so that whistleblowing, the ability of people to speak out and to point to malpractice is limited because of fear, low trust environments across some places. In terms of risk management and managing the risks around these areas, weak risk frameworks, poor integration with quality assurance systems, limited assurance models, and inadequate risk monitoring. In terms of stakeholder participation, so weak student voice across the sector, and I take Prof. Jansen's input here and the understanding of what is appropriate student voice in which context is really a critical issue to consider. Ineffective, underutilized institutional forums that either underplay or overplay their role, as we also heard earlier. a limited engagement in planning, and low inclusivity of the range of institutional stakeholders in governance matters. Council effectiveness, also an issue that was picked up on. Selection is an issue, as we've already heard, but also inadequate training, a weak role understanding, vacancies and instability in council, and operational interference risks. So councils becoming complicit in taking part in operational matters and operational decisions. So in summary, I think institutional capture risks result from these weaknesses, of fragmented governance ecosystems, limited governance capabilities, blurred governance boundaries, weak council oversight, weak system alignment, insufficient leadership capacity, high leadership turnover in some of our institutions, poor feedback loops, a suppressed stakeholder voice, weak accountability systems, and policy and non-compliance. And if we had to look at the kind of risk intensity from these from high to medium, we can kind of do the analysis that shows that some of these have much higher potential to create the context for institutional capture. They strongly occur across the system, and when they occur, their impact is high. So the issue of council effectiveness is really a key issue. The issue of policy implementation is really a key issue. Leadership stability, and then others that are also important, strategy alignment, accountability systems, and stakeholder voice. So the CHE is engaged with this issue at this point in time. We are undertaking a system-wide research project. It is underway. The project is seeking to systematically assess the extent to which the statutory governance structures function according to their mandates, and it wants to unpack how institutional governance in higher education operates across multiple interconnected dimensions. We hope that this will also provide further insights in addition to what the institutional audit reports and other documentation that's emanated from the audits are telling us about governance at this point in time, as a way then of thinking about strategies to strengthen from the CHE side, but also from the side of the system and institutions. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Witty-Green. We'll move straight on to our next input, Mr. Ahmed Isop from the University of Johannesburg. Mr. Isop, are you present?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Letitia. I will be very brief. Much of what I wanted to say has already been said, particularly by Jonathan, as I had expected in terms of being familiar with his book, Corrupted. The main point I want to make is that... Can you... Sorry.
Michelle, please mute.
Muted.
Thank you. The main point I want to make is that where councils have failed or have been ineffective, and it's not all councils, but where that has occurred, and particularly where the minister has intervened and appointed assessors and so forth, is largely due, in my view, to the particular form in which the structure and composition of councils was envisaged in the 1997 Higher Education Act, specifically the development and implementation of a stakeholder model. Councils have 40% of council members are internal. The internal members represent particular constituencies, staff, students, management, and so on, which was informed at the time by the demands of the democratization of the education system, which, as those of you familiar, in the 1980s was a key demand of the anti-apartheid movement in education. And as Jonathan has pointed out, stakeholder representation, they're not only represented in councils in attendance in terms of getting their views heard, but they have voting rights. And they're unable to stay in their lane, as Jonathan pointed out. Stakeholders, whether students, staff, including management. It's very surprising and inappropriate that management and all members of senior management in many cases have voting rights. So a lot of the internal conflicts within management get played out in council, internal conflicts between students and management that are not resolved within the institution get played out in council, and so forth. And while 60% of council members are external, the external members are not immune from looking after their own interests either, particularly given the fact that institutions, there are large commercial and economic opportunities within institutions. So as Jonathan pointed out, when it comes to tenders and so forth, the alliance is made across the different external and internal constituents in higher education, or on council, sorry. And even where external members are not complicit, where the opportunities may not exist, it's arguable whether they understand the academic project, the scholarly project in higher education, the fact that many of them, even if they're not corrupt, come from municipalities, may represent donors, the local business forum and so forth, have little or no understanding of the higher education project. And as many vice chancellors that I had interviewed for a project at the CHE at the time indicated that by and large, most council members, external council members, are passengers. They're not able to participate in strategic debate. They're not able to provide any direction. And either the council becomes a rubber stamp in those cases for management, and it doesn't take the academic project forward. So as Jonathan has pointed out, we need to relook, we need to rethink, and we need to reopen the discussion about the structure and composition of councils. I agree, in my view, there's a debate to be had about whether it's 7 or 10 or 12. Council members should be carefully chosen for their understanding of the higher education project, for the particular skills they bring and wisdom about the understanding of the project. Higher education institutions are complex, so we do need people with the appropriate financial, legal, human resource skills, but more importantly, an understanding of the higher education project. As one vice chancellor pointed out, when he wanted to inquire about what the trends in the economy were, it wasn't the council members who represented the business community on the council who were able to provide that information. He needed to bring together the captains of industry to get a better understanding of where industry was moving, what the challenges were, and so forth. So we need smaller councils that are cohesive, collegial, and are effective and efficient in decision making. Council members, we need to develop fairly clear criteria of what kind of council members we want. We may want a public nomination and selection process in order to ensure the independence of the selection. Finally, I should just say, I think it's not suggesting that creating small councils necessarily will solve all the problems of institutional capture, because as different speakers have pointed out, capture is also linked to the broader issues and broader capture issues within the society as a whole, but it's a step forward. There's a need for a discussion. The CHE, and I should alert Witty to this, in 2014, developed a discussion document precisely on rethinking the role of councils, which for a range of reasons at the time was not released for discussion. And I think it's an opportune moment for us to rethink what the role and who should be on council. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Isop, for highlighting the challenges of council. And I think one of the critical aspects is actually to look at the skills mix of the council members before we call for new members on council. Otherwise, we just get anybody and we find that the council is not properly constituted. Can we move on now to our next contributor, Professor Lungisile Ntsebeza? Is the chair of council at the University of Fort Hare. Professor Ntsebeza.
Good afternoon. First, I must warn you that I might be cut off. I'm doing field work in rural Eastern Cape, the Drakensberg Mountains. and the network
you
is not good.
You must stand
Can
where
you
you
hear
are.
me?
We can hear you clearly where you are now.
Okay, no, that's good. Now let's hope it will sustain me for the next 10 minutes. And the other thing is that I'm no longer chair of the University of Water Council. I'm a former chairperson of the University of Fort-Hare. I was a member of that council between 2020 and 2024. The first 2 years, I was an ordinary member of council, and the last 2 years of my term, I served as a chairperson of council.
Welcome to the former chair club.
Yes, yeah, that's a celebrated club. Yeah. And when I unexpectedly received a letter from the then Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Bladen Zimande, appointing me as a member of the Fort-Hare Council, I did not hesitate to accept the appointment. At the time, I was the director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town, where I held 2 research chairs, the NRF research chair and the AC Jordan chair in African Studies. I had, since 2007, been at the forefront of efforts to transform UCT as a university of and for Africa, not merely as a university that is geographically based in Africa, pushing, put crudely, a colonial agenda. After more than a decade, I realized how difficult it was to transform a university such as UCT, which is deeply entrenched in a colonial tradition. The invitation to be a member of council came when I was confronted with what I would call a dilemma. For me, Fort-Hare did not, and indeed does not carry the colonial burden that the likes of UCT carry. If anything, it is a legacy of having produced eminent leaders of various sorts. From my research of the saga involving UCT and the late Archie Mafeje, and I'm sure most of us now know who Archie Mafeje was, I was aware of how powerful university council could be. For those of you who are not familiar with what became known as the Mafeje affair, the UCT Council succumbed to the apartheid state pressure and rescinded its own decision to appoint Archie Mafeje as a senior lecturer simply on the grounds that Mafeje was Black and the apartheid state was against the appointment of Blacks to so-called white higher education institutions. The result was that Mafeje was never appointed, showing how powerful, as I said, university councils can be. This is the context that one should understand why I did not hesitate to accept the invitation from the then minister. My expectation was that as council, we would devote our energies in monitoring and supporting the university transformation agenda. At the heart of this agenda is the core business of any university worth the salt, which is research, teaching, learning, and community engagement. It's an area I know that Jonathan and Ahmed touched on. This is what I want to bring to this discussion too. My contention is that whoever is in university matters should take the core business of the institution as a point of departure around which everything else hinges. The second issue I want to put on the agenda is the importance of recognizing and emphasizing the right of scholars and students to research, teach, learn without fear of internal and external interference, censorship, and punishment. In short, we should recognize and emphasize the importance of academic freedom and academic freedom as a right. The twin side of academic freedom, of course, is institutional autonomy. Not going to dwell on this, because this audience is familiar with these concepts. They are, as far as I am concerned, the lifeblood of academic life. So this discussion raises questions about the composition of university councils. Once again, this has been raised already, and the criteria used to appoint them. To what extent are the skills that councillors bring to council in line with the kind of university I've just highlighted? I'm also keen to know the criteria that the minister uses to appoint his or her appointees and the extent to which they consider the qualities of a member of a university council. To the extent to which the minister does or does not consider recommendations by the university council or management. The extent to which the minister does or does not consider recommendations made by the university council or management is also important to note. My view is that the composition of university councils and the criteria used to appoint them is something worth pondering upon. Candidates should be scrutinized about their understanding of the nature of a university, its core business, and the importance they attach to the notion of a university as autonomous and subscribing to the principles of academic freedom. What I am suggesting emanates from my 4-year experience as a member of the University of Fort Hare Council. And I would like to examples, because I would like to, but the pressure of time doesn't allow me to do that. So I'm just going to highlight the key principles. And just not to close, I would like to make the recommendation or the observation that when council members are appointed or have been appointed, they should be inducted, and as part of the process of induction, the matters that I have raised about the core business of a university and institutional autonomy should be part of the induction. My experience of Fort Hare is that we never really went through these processes. And for me, this accounted for the chaos that took place, especially in the first 2 years of my being a member of council. I must say that the last 2 years, and I don't know whether it's because I was the chairperson, we did manage to focus on the academic agenda of the university. And there are quite a number of things, achievements that we got. Thank you. Hello?
Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't find my unmute. Thank you very much, Professor Besa, for your inputs and sharing your experiences, and particularly the need to look at the processes of how members of council are appointed and what skills they actually bring to the council. Thank you. For our last input, I'm going to ask Professor Phumla Mganga. He's also former chair of the UKZN Council. Dr. Phumla.
Morning, Prof. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. You are welcome to proceed.
Thank you for the opportunity and good morning. And thank you for allowing me to share my over 20 years of experience in higher education governance. Having been the last speaker, I initially had a presentation that I'd prepared, but then I thought, let me pull out some of the dominant themes that have emerged in today's discussion and then juxtapose those with some of the inputs that I had in mind. There is a dominant theme around council being the apex of governance in an institution. And this dominant theme is suggesting that we need to undertake a deep dive into the constitution of council, the manner in which councils are constituted. I concur with this assertion, but I think we need to just take a step back. And I think Prof. Tembu and I think Jonathan also suggested that part of where we are in society today as South Africans and the way in which we view our higher education system and the way in which it is run draws its genesis from our governance system and our Higher Education Act. And that assumes that the university in its current form is governed through a cooperative governance model where a balance of stakeholders come together to act in the best interests of the university. Now, that assumption has a fault line, because the fault line is that the assumption is that those various stakeholder groupings are able to exist in equilibrium and at all times act in the best interest of the institution, which is not always the case. When I finished at UKZN as chair of council, I was invited by a very high-profile university that I will not mention, and I was approached by the head of convocation of that institution to serve as the chair of council. And when I met with this particular grouping of convocation, they said to me that they feel that having chaired at UKZN over the period of time that I chaired, I was the appropriate person to chair council. And I said to them, well, how is it that a grouping of convocation can invite me to be a chair of council? What that showed me was that there was already a disproportionate power that convocation had in that institution. So I said to them, there is no ways that a grouping within convocation can invite me to become the chair of council. And for that reason, I retract. I choose not to be part of that process. And there were certain parties, even within the Department of Higher Education, who were encouraging me to accept this position. But from my perspective, it was classical to what has been described as institutional capture. In that particular institution, the convocation were very confident that that is the role that I should play. And in my view, that was already a fault line in that institution. And that was not the institution that I wanted to be part of. And therefore, this system of cooperative governance that assumes that all these parties can exist where there isn't a disproportionate power base that one of these parties can assume is a fault line, I think, in our higher education system. So if you look at the institution, at the level of the institution, where either the students, as Professor Tembu suggests, or convocation, or Senate, or any party within that institution has got a disproportionate power base in relation to what the governance framework articulates should be its power base, is when you get a breakdown and you get that seeping institutional capture that begins to occur over a period of time. And I would like to focus this conversation on, from a governance point of view, what are the early signs of institutional capture and what are the mechanisms of governance guardrails that we should put in place, bearing in mind that the discussion around the constitution of council is really important. I heard what Prof. Jansen said about the 7 members, which kind of is very similar to the other part of my life, which is being involved on various listed South African boards. I'm not sure that that is the ideal, the number of 7, which is the odd number. I'm not sure that that's the ideal model. However, I think that a conversation needs to occur where we jointly build a consensus around what is the appropriate model for governance in higher education in South Africa. The current model is problematic in my view, but the extreme corporate model is also not the solution, based on my personal experience of having served on corporate boards for over 30 years. Neither is that the ideal solution. There is a hybrid somewhere that is appropriate to ensure that, as most people on this forum have said, that the academy must have centrality, the academic project must have centrality in the institution. So if we then say, given that that is a conversation that must happen, but that is probably a medium to long-term solution or outcome, which I think is very interesting and very important and needs various people to contribute and needs a multiplicity of voices, a very polyvocal debate. But within the institutions as they sit, what are the governance guardrails that will ensure that, given all the pressures that are enacted on our higher education institutions, that our governance framework remains stable and resilient? Firstly, if you look at the way in which councils are constituted, let me call it the architecture of council. Councils have got the council and their subcommittees, and then they have their relationships with convocation, senate, students, etc. In that ecosystem, it is important, and I think this has been said earlier on, that those entities must execute their mandates. And in executing their mandates, must ensure that there is a cross-cutting governance risk framework. What I mean by cross-cutting governance risk framework is that your audit and risk committee normally looks at risk, but there is an emphasis or a disproportionate discussion on financial risk. There are a whole lot of other institutional risks that include governance risks, stakeholder risk, institutional stability risk that must be looked at, because those are the areas where the risks and the leakage occurs and allow for fissures that enable institutional capture. So how do you make your governance framework more resilient? One, at the level of the institution, where it is obvious that a particular, whether it's a subcommittee or whether a particular formation within the institution has got disproportionate power in relation to what it should have in terms of the framework, then there is a problem, and that is a risk that is a risk area. The other one is what I call extreme micromanagement or extreme overreach, and I think that has also been mentioned today, where certain structures of council or certain individuals within council then have this positive engagement, but that then reaches into micromanagement and extreme overreach. In that instance, that becomes a risk. It becomes a risk because in that you have that risk of institutional capture. Another one is the absence of a very, very robust conflict of interest framework. Conflict of interest, not just conceptualized as actual conflict of interest, but potential conflict of interest and perceived conflict of interest. A very robust conflict of interest framework needs to cut across the entire institution and needs to be managed in a manner that is understood and that is practical, right from the policy, the implementation, and the guidelines that exist around conflicts of interest within council. The other one is that the system of council must be able to self-regulate itself. So where it becomes evident that there is a breakdown, for example, when meetings take too long, longer than they generally should, to me that is normally a red sign. When you've got a disproportionate voice that a particular segment of council has over influence, decision-making, problem-solving, the policy framework and the execution framework, then that becomes a risk. When capital allocation decisions or resource allocation decisions become dominant around certain individuals, then that is a risk area. When there is a lack of robust debate and there is an emphasis on majority thinking or high degrees of consensus, that is a risk, because you always need you need cohesion, but you also need differentiation in a governance system, because whilst cohesion is important, but differentiation is also important, allowing for that debate to occur. So while we review our acts, our institutional statutes, our governance frameworks, and we really review the notion of cooperative governance and stakeholder governance, I think that's critical. In the meantime, in the short term, we need to implement mechanisms within our governance framework that strengthen our governance framework. And this forum doesn't give me the opportunity to go through these in detail, but if you look at governance worldwide, there are generally accepted practices. And what I've observed is that having been involved in governance in civil society, in the corporate sector, and in the higher education sector, there are some common themes that would enable us to strengthen our governance systems. But at the end of the day, and I think this was said by Professor Mthembu, it all starts with the individual. As individuals, we come in there as leaders who should come with an ethical compass, leaders who should understand that their role is to be effective, leaders who must apply professional skepticism in any discourse or debate in council, leaders who should enter into a meeting with a loose hypothesis, not a mandate that was discussed somewhere outside the university environment, leaders who understand what it means to be counterintuitive in thinking, leaders who are judicious, who exercise critical thinking, who are open-minded, and who exercise restraint in the face of power, of the temptation of power. So it all ends and begins with us as leaders and how we exercise a very important mandate that we have, which is the academy. And therefore, if you think about this notion of institutional capture, in conclusion, you've got to look at it within the context of the framework, the institution, then the interpersonal framework and the interpersonal relations, then ourselves as individuals. So it cuts across those three levels, the institutional, the interpersonal, and the individual. And ultimately, at the core of it is individuals who must exercise servant leadership, who must exercise a humility to the mandate and to the role of higher education, and who must practice ethical leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pumla. Very interesting take, and thank you for raising the issue of the individual, because at the end, it's individuals that actually make sure that the governance of the institutions are proper and the interest of the institutions are put first. Thank you very much for that input. We are going to go into taking questions and engagements and comments. We've got 20 minutes to do that. We're already going to run a little bit over schedule. It's now 11:45. But before I just open it for questions, I'm going to request that there is an evaluation form that has been posted. And I think the host would really like to hear your feedback on this. It will help to plan future webinars according to your needs. So I'm going to request all of us to try and complete that evaluation form. Thank you. Can I now open it to questions? I'm going to try and see if I can see hands. Otherwise, I'm going to ask the technical team to assist me. Go to the participants. I can see Tasmin. You can Then there's, let me just list, there's Tasmin, and then there's Joel Baloyi. For now, we've got only those two hands. I'm going to ask them to, I'm going to ask the technical team to also look on the chats if we've got any questions. After the two of you, I'll ask if there are any questions from the chat. Tasneem, you may proceed.
Morning, everybody. Thank you. Tasneem Watbala here, General Counsel at Wits University. Thank you for the incredibly insightful and important conversation. Mine is really a comment, and it's directed at what we call our senior to middle management arm of the university. While I appreciate that the conversation here is mainly directed at leadership, at the council, and also at the senior executive teams. We mustn't forget the importance of ensuring that the senior to middle management of institutions have the skill sets that is necessary to stay down, instances where they need to entrench proper governance, because they hold the institutional memory of organizations. We have, fortunately at Wits, we've had very good councils over the years, chairs of councils and executives and vice chancellors. But it is that arm of institutions who hold the institutional memory. Vice chancellors come and go, council chairs come and go. And so really the point I wanted to make is that if you don't have that level of management in a university, equipped with the proper skill sets, equipped with the courage to kind of manage instances where there's poor or eroding governance, then I think that is where institutions are likely to fail. And so my recommendation is that we start targeting those levels of management, and that we perhaps create a community of practice of sorts, perhaps with some of the really important and wise counsel, wise individuals who have spoken here, who can serve as a sounding board for that level of management sometimes, and also as confidants, because often the space, as the head of legal, I can tell you, often the space is quite lonely. You have executives that you can rely on, but it does help to sometimes engage outside of those parameters. But thank you very much for the useful conversation. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you, Tasmin. I think all of us in higher education needs to actually be part of this engagement and identification of the risks of institutional capture. Baloyi?
Thank you so much, and I want to appreciate the presentations that came from the esteemed colleagues. Very insightful. I think my observation relates to the role of the registrar, and Professor Mthembu was very articulate in terms of that role and the support that the registrar has to give or needs to give in terms of the governance processes. But I think one of the problems is perhaps how that role is perceived. And I think it also has to do with the Higher Education Act not being elaborate in terms of that role and what it is, and people then seeing it as just a mere secretary or maybe a glorified clerk. And I think that it would help if that role is more is better clarified, so that the advisory and support role of the registrar can be clearly articulated, and thus avoiding situations of tensions and frictions. And I think if you look, for example, in the private sector environment, where in the Companies Act, that role of the company secretary is very clearly articulated. And this, of course, was something that was as a result of development over time, where even in that space, the company secretary was initially seen as some sort of glorified clerk, but over time that role was better defined. and also then in that case, ensuring that the registrars can perform their functions in an environment where they know, the framework itself clearly articulates their role. So I think that is in terms of when we talk about processes of reviewing the governance landscape, that aspect is very clear. If you look at the Higher Education Act, the statement that is made regarding registrars is merely one that says the registrar is a secretary to the council. Even the definition of registrar doesn't relate to university registrars. It relates to the Director General as registrar of private higher education institutions. So I think that would go a long way in terms of enhancing the space. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for highlighting the need for looking at the registrar position. Let me take Judy. Judy Favish, you may proceed. You're still muted.
Yes. Thank you very much and for the excellent and very useful presentations. I wondered whether we don't also need to go back to or consider a point that Dr. Lewin made in her introduction, which was to stress that these debates happen within a context in South Africa of extreme inequalities, high levels of unemployment, and high levels of poverty. And that, I think, poses potentially particular challenges for higher education institutions that are located within regions where universities are really effectively the only, but may not be the only, but certainly the major source of employment and income for a particular region. And if we take that into consideration, then it seems to me that the goal in the Higher Education Act of higher education institutions being responsive to the needs of their region, etc., can often be hijacked, if you like, by those who seek to capture an institution, and it's presented then as wanting to enhance the responsiveness of the institution, so that the goal actually becomes distorted in a way that serves the interests of potentially stakeholders who are wanting to gain access to the resources of the institution. So I don't know, I saw Brian Schroeder made a point about, looking in more depth at how from the outside initiatives or overtures are made that enable capture to happen more easily. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Judy. I'm just going to ask the presenters if they would like to make comments on any of the three inputs that we've had. Any of the presenters? Comments?
Prof. Moja, if I may just comment on the earlier point about the analogy that was drawn between the Companies Act and the Company Secretary and the Registrar. To the extent that that role should be clearly articulated in a framework, a legislated framework, I concur with that. But I do think that the role of the registrar is far more powerful than that of the company secretary, because the registrar has got line function over the academy and the core purpose of the academy, where the company secretary's primary role is to protect the governance environment. But where I agree with the suggestion is that where that role is more strongly articulated and explained, I think that that will give more power to that particular portfolio.
Thank you, Pumla. Any other comments from the presenters?
Chair, we also have 3 questions on the chat that we can take as well.
Okay, yeah, I was just waiting for the presenters to comment. It looks like there's no further comment. Can you read through the questions from the chat?
Yeah, there's 2 questions that came from PV. That's the only identification of the source. It came during Prof. Janssen's presentation. The question is, at what point do legitimate stakeholder interest cross into state capture enabling behavior? And what internal mechanism should exist to flag that line before it is crossed? And the second one, which was a follow-up, was, does Higher Education Act provide sufficient tools for DHET to intervene early before governance materially breaks down? What intermediate regulatory intervention should exist between monitoring and administration? And if you allow, Chair, I can take the last one, which relates to that, which was related to CHE. Based on the outcomes of the audits, what will the CHE regard as adequate training for council members, both internally and external? Does the CHE consider institutionally self-administered inductions as adequate, or should a component of the council members' training be independently delivered? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I ask Prof. Janssen to comment on the questions? But all other members you'll also have an opportunity to make comments on all the questions, but I'll just start with Prof. Janssen first, and then I'll go to Dr. Wittigre. Prof. Janssen? Is Prof. Janssen there? Support team, can we see Prof. Janssen? Prof. Mtembu?
Yes.
I see you're
While
muted.
Professor Janssen might be coming through, let me make comments on the question about whether the HE Act has sufficient tools for DHET to intervene. The assumption with that question is that DHET's intervention is devoid of any attempts at capture in itself, and that it's a tool that has been working well in the higher education sector. And the reality is that that is not true either, that one, the tool has been working well, that two, it does not come with attempts at institutional capture. So there is also the intervention, which somebody has to intervene indeed when things are wrong. But when you get a situation where you might have one person playing the role of management, reporting to themselves as counsel, there is just something wrong. In fact, I think it creates a conducive environment for capture through that one individual who obviously then reports only to the minister. I'm not saying that administrators who have been appointed have been doing that, but I'm simply saying that a situation where one individual reports to himself or herself creates an easy entry into institutional capture. So, whilst there needs to be intervention, what the type of intervention should be is a big question here. I think what we currently have, where one person becomes everything, is just patently wrong. Whether you look at the private sector, you look at the public sector, to have a one-man, one-woman show like that is really a recipe for disaster. That's why there are universities that have had administrators over and over without their problems being resolved. So I think whilst the question might be, there must be sufficient tools, that in itself, that kind of intervention needs to be looked into, just like the issue of the size of councils, the role of the secretary to council, and so forth. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Is Professor Johnson back on?
Letitia, can I come in?
Okay, come in, Peter.
It does seem to me, in relation to what Tandwa is saying, that one of the challenges is not so much that the administrator in a single person has all the power, because there's a limited time period, I forget what the latest amendments to the Act are, in which the administrator performs the function, whether as council or as management. I think the challenge that we face is administrators, even if they're there with a team, are there for a short period of time. I think it's 18 months to 2 years, I forget. But often restructuring an institution, addressing the challenges, if you want, of institutional capture or academic deficiencies and so forth, requires a much longer time frame. It can't be done in 18 months or 2 years. Often what we find, as Tanwa said, the administrator leaves and the problems re-emerge. So it does require a long-term view of how one intervenes and what appropriate interventions are necessary. So it may require a team going in for 5 or 10 years to restructure and turn an institution around. It can't be done overnight. It can't be done in a short term. So I think that's one of the challenges with the current provisions of the tools in the Act, which limits the role of an administrator and the timeframes within which he or she introduces change to the institution.
Thank you, Mr. Isop. I think it's the same thing that Prof. Tando is talking about, is the kind of intervention. If the institutional capture is so deeply seated, putting an administrator for a short period, will it actually rescue that institution, or it's just going to put a bandage on top and the wound will continue to rot underneath? Thank you very much. If we haven't got any further comments, seeing it is now 5 minutes past 12, I hope we all had an opportunity to learn something. We will have takeaways, but I'm going to now call upon Professor Thandi again to briefly give us the strategic takeaways and way forward. Professor Thandi.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I'm aware that a lot of people have left the webinar already, so I'm going to be as quick as I can. I just want to say, I think it was a really great format to be able to hear in depth from 2 keynote speakers and then have 4 respondents. I think we had a really diverse set of inputs, and I think it was drawn from people who have extensive experience, and these are respected colleagues with experience in governance and leadership of universities. So I think we've heard a really deep analysis today of the effects of institutional capture on our public universities, and also understanding the multiple causes of instability at our institutions. I think that the work that Witty outlined in the institutional audits reinforces the prior work on the good governance indicators, which were also mentioned in the chat. So I think we've got a very good outline of the risks, and I think I would want to say that we know what the risks are, and I think as a sector we have the knowledge that we need in order to maintain as much as possible good governance and to prevent institutions from being taken over for the wrong reasons. I think we heard some really interesting analysis as well, drawn from substantive experience about how external influences, often enabled by internal stakeholders, destabilize universities, which then create the conditions for capture. And I think we can all think of current examples and recent examples of that. Prof. Jansen was very clear to point out that capture is a systematic process, it's deliberate, and it's intentional. While what's also been described a lot is also about the conditions and the context within which capture can happen. But I think what was critical about his input was also understanding the issue of academic fraud and corruption, and how corrupt practices, and particularly academically corrupt practices, have infiltrated universities, and actually how that has begun to change cultures of institutions. And I think this is something we need to reflect much more on as a sector, at all levels. Prof. Mthembu described the realities of co-governance expectations among stakeholders at universities and the kinds of pressures that these put on institutions and on individual leaders with higher education. He really pointed out a lot of the inherent dangers of holding the line against such capture. But I think he also made some important points that VCs and even more so registrars will never be popular in institutions. It's not their job to be popular. The importance of the registrar's office was also pointed out by many, and I fully agree with Pumla that in some way registrars are absolutely critical. They're at the center of both governance and academic integrity. And that is so important for institutions. And we've seen where registrars' offices fail, institutions fail. So I think that's something we need to think about, but also to think about what we want from our leaders is not necessarily for them to be popular, but for them to hold the line in terms of what universities are supposed to do. And I think Prof. Mthembu described the context so profoundly, in the conditions which universities, both affected by external and internal pressures, become hollowed out, and the danger of losing the academic project of universities, which others have also talked to, and also the warning that it doesn't happen overnight. Prof. Nsebeza also talked about how important it is to put the core business of universities at the center of governance work. And I think this is an attitude that must be at the foundation of what it is that individuals and collective councils do, even though there will always be disagreement within councils about what this is, what is in the best interest of universities. I think the question I would ask then, and this is maybe some of the questions that people are beginning to push, is, but do we have the will to respond to all of these pressures? I think there were lots and lots of practical examples. There's a big discussion about the structure and size of councils, which Ahmed Esop talked about, and to a certain extent, Prof. Jansen as well. What are the composition of councils, the criteria for joining councils? And I think we definitely need more in-depth conversations about that. There's a big conversation about the role of council chairs, the relationships between chairs, VCs, and registrars. And there's a lot of knowledge that we have about this, but how often are we actively thinking about how this works? Lots of ideas about governance issues within institutions, and issues about the kind of expertise necessary, but also a really important point about the different levels of leadership within institutions. So I think that's also important. There's a big question about remuneration of council members, how that should happen, under what circumstances, and to what level. And then an issue, I think, about what kind of expertise actually constitutes the necessary expertise for working on a university council. It's not a generic skill to be a university councillor. And I think then Prof. Mthembu also gave us a whole lot of practical suggestions. I think the takeaway for me is that there's no one answer to all of these questions. There are many things that can be done and should be done to protect universities. Universities are public institutions and they must be protected for future generations. I want to say then, and this talks to the point that Prof. Mthembu was saying about silence around the problem when so much is happening. Pumla Nganga has also shared a lot of her experience with us about what some of the guardrails are. And I think we know some of these, but I think we need to think about how we can institutionalize them. Others have said what the early signs are and how we notice these. I want to ask the question of us to say, are we aware of the kinds of things? Are we so busy holding the line in an isolated way as people who are fighting in their own institutions? And I think We need to support those who are isolating themselves or who are effectively isolated in their public institutions. But I also think that we need to speak for universities, the point that I made earlier. I don't know how many of you are aware that there is currently a process to amend the Higher Education Act. So we take the Higher Education Act and the current configuration of our system for granted. There's no absolute guarantee that that is always going to be the case. We need to listen to what people are saying outside the universities as well, because the current framing is not guaranteed. And I think we need to look at other countries as well, where, you know, presidents appoint vice chancellors and council chairs, and where academic freedom is under severe threat. This is no longer something that happens in the global south. It's happening actively in the global north as well. So I think we need to watch these things. Are you aware that there's a National Convocation Association that has been formed in South Africa? I think there are warning signs to this as well, but maybe there are also opportunities because it's, you know, in terms of what convocations should be doing, which is to particularly for supporting the fundraising of institutions and many other positive roles that they can play. So I'm just saying, while we're talking about these things are happening in the environment. And I think there's some very important suggestions for us as DHET. I think when we talk about ministerial intervention, we need to think about some of the recommendations about single administrators and the possibility of administration teams, and of course the time frames for these. But I think there's a lot more we can do systematically and collaboratively. And I think this is a great webinar, and if you can share the presentations with everyone, will be great, and we can take this forward into the next level of discussion. But at the end of the day, I think we need to advocate for universities, not just for our own sake and for those of us who work in them, but to protect their long-term status for the future. And we all have to be active in this. It's not something that single individuals should be isolated and left to deal with alone. But again, there's not going to be one answer to these problems. We're going to have to approach it from many different angles. But thank you so much to the speakers, and thanks for organizing this webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Thandi. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoyed all the presentations, and we are leaving this webinar a little bit more enlightened and with greater understanding of some of the challenges. And I think it's for us to go back to our institutions and start looking at what are the specific challenges in our institution and what can we do about it, and become part of those advocates that are actually going to put the interest of the universities first and protect its assets. Just in closing, I just need to do a few thank yous. First, I'm going to thank USAf, Leadership and Management Strategy Group, for thinking of this webinars. I think this is the first of the webinars that they are planning, and I hope we are going to see a lot of them coming through. Then particularly thank Professor Peter Mbati and his team for the logistics of getting this webinar going. And I'm really grateful to the technical team who supported me, made it easy for me to facilitate this webinar. I must thank Thandi from DHET. I think your participation here shows that DHET takes these matters serious, and that you are willing to be engaging with the universities as the stakeholders. And then I'll also thank all the contributors, that our two keynote presenters, Professor Johnson and Professor Mthembu, and the four panelists, Dr. Green, Mr. Isop, Professor Ntsebeza, and Dr. Phumla Mganga. Your insights have given us quite a lot to think about. And I think as we all go back to our institutions, we will actually start thinking these things through. And last but not least, I must thank all of you, the participants. And as I said, I hope we leave this webinar enriched, and we are going to go back to our institutions and choose to protect the university asset and to also put the interest of our institutions first. Thank you all. I'm not so sure if Peter has got anything housekeeping this thing before I close the webinar.
Thank you very much, Prof. Moja. Really, we want to appreciate your role. No further inputs from our side, Prof. Moja. Thank you very much to you too.
Okay, thank you. The webinar is now closed, and I wish you a pleasant afternoon and a good week ahead. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chair. Thank you. Bye.